Good afternoon. So yes, he just asked me if this was my first time at OSMC, and I had to look, and I think it's the fourth time, and it was an OSDC before, so I've been here quite a lot. Today I'm going to talk about how not to do observability, and it's mostly based off experiences. Who am I? I'm Kris Buytaert. Ages ago I used to be a developer. I stopped saying in what kind of crappy languages, because some people take offense to naming their favorite language. Just take your time. And then I became an operations person, because I was the only one who knew how to put a machine in a rack and figure out all of those things. Most people know me because the title of my blog, which is Everything is a fucking DNS problem, except when it's a BGP problem or an NTP problem or a spanning tree problem. And obviously people know that DNS stands for DevOps Needs to She. In my spare time, I've also been organizing a bunch of conferences. About 12 years ago, I started DevOps Days together with Patrick, so apologies for everybody who's now a DevOps engineer. That was absolutely not the plan. You should be YAML engineers. And together with Tushan, I also run config management camp and load days and things like that. So, I'm wondering if I actually should tell you this. What is monitoring? I mean, monitoring is that we have a high-level overview of what is running in our infrastructure, that we know the state of a service or a component, that we actually see if it's running, if it's still available, if it is still there. It's not so much about performance. It's not so much about how it is running. And the real question is, what's going on? What is observability? Well, observability is more figuring out how my services behave. Looking at things from their point of view. And actually trying to do that without writing specific code for those things. So, figuring out why things are happening within your infrastructure. And they obviously connect, because everybody needs monitoring. If your end user calls and things are down, you're doing it wrong. And most organizations, if they're lucky, monitoring is enough, because things are just resilient, and you build them in a good way, and you can actually survive data center fires. And you know that things are on fire, but things are still running. And my colleague Julien actually said, well, observability is actually removing that luck and making sure that you know what things do. I think Philip said that there were more than 3 pillars. I'm not going to add that. I know there's a bunch of repetition here. But most of us look at it as metrics, logs, and traces. Metrics, like things like server requests, memory, how many people are logging in, things like that. We look at logs, like what is happening on the system. Some component is doing something, and we actually derive metrics from those logs. And traces, like where are things talking to? Where do we see things slowing down? How long does a certain part take? So that's what observability is about. But let's take a step back. Where do most people get stuck? Well, we're at OSMC, so most of you should know this. Where does monitoring break? Well, lots of people have a monitoring setup which is totally out of sync from reality. And that is because they fail to automate it. Because they're still doing things manually. Because keeping monitoring in sync with reality is a lot of work. It's not. It's that easy if you automate it. But if you don't, then you get alert fatigue, and people just stop looking at your monitoring because it's broken. And that is still today the biggest challenge. Like, automate your things. So with that said, I work for an open source consultancy. We've been helping a lot of customers to use those tools, to change their culture. And when you do that, you get to see the worst of everything. So you kind of get a really, really bad view on how the world works. And then you start talking to other people, and they confirm that view, which is kind of scary. So I'm going to talk about a bunch of those cases, and they might sound familiar to you, they might not. The first one is actually a large government agency. And they were in trouble with their monitoring. They had a really large check-MK setup, they had a lot of custom checks in there, but they had no automation. Things was pretty much built manually. They had some custom CMDB where they were trying to put in what they had, but they had built it themselves, and there was not really a sync between their monitoring system and their CMDB. And obviously their on-call team was unhappy. I mean, they were absolutely happy with the tool they had. They liked the tool, it did what it needed to do, but they were really unhappy with the way they were being treated. Like, people would just shut down offices and not tell them, and their monitoring would pop up and say, hey, things are broken here, and then they started calling, like, yeah, but we just closed that office, you don't need to monitor this anymore. Or people would decommission a service and not tell them, and then they wouldn't be able to find the people responsible for that service anymore, so they didn't know if this was actually a problem, or if, well, it was just things as usual. There was no ownership for service. And because of those problems, management at some point said, we need to do this new thing. We need to do observability. So yeah, they set out and said, hey, we're going to do this new thing. We're going to take a completely new tool, start from scratch. We're going to move to Prometheus because that's going to fix all of our problems. And 1 year later, yeah, they tried to get Prometheus up and going. Obviously, from a tool point of view, it works. From getting a bunch of metrics out of some of their new systems, it works. But the plan was learn some things and then drop the old setup. What do you think that happened? I mean, now they have 2 platforms that are broken. The old tool is still being used as the primary alerting tool, and rather than actually moving forward, they now have 2 tools to manage, and they're both in a broken state. And real observability? They didn't go beyond some basic metrics out of Prometheus. But now they were cool kids. They had some hipster credit because they were using Prometheus. So, not really a fun place to be. Second case is a setup that really was using Ikinga heavily. They had no manual configurations. Everything they did was really infrastructure as code. Puppet was automating everything, and they were really in sync with what they had until they started building a new container infrastructure. And obviously, they were like, this is the opportunity to add a new tool. This is the opportunity to use Prometheus for container stuff because it's more volatile, it's flexible. And they pretty much said, we're going to try Prometheus here and also do it for alerting. The original setup was a bunch of people that had 24/7 on call. They were really happy. Things were running smooth. Didn't get paged that much. But the new platform, well, only an isolated set of people got alerted via Alert Manager on Telegram. And the kind of alerts that they were getting were really confusing. Like, some service is down on the production cluster, while it was actually a development setup with the wrong name in there. And they really had a bunch of false positives. And where the team that was having a fully automated Ikinga setup had almost no false positive, a really good feedback loop between the developers and the ops folks trying to fix things fast. With the new setup, it was much more difficult. And the idea would be that the original team would actually take into operations the new service, but they just refused. They said, no, we're not going to be on call on this platform. It's not stable enough. The alerts you give us are too confusing. We don't even know what to do when we get an alert like that. It doesn't actually tell us what's wrong. They improved, they started working together, they started actually sitting together and saying, hey, look at what we have here. This is how we get alerts today. We should build and work together and get to a point where the alerts we get from the other platform are the same quality, the same amount of false positive or not. And it took them more than a year to actually get there. Like, put in place a new tool, it's going to be fine, right? No, it needs work. You need to work together with your peers to actually use those new tools. And about 18 months down the road, they actually started using that platform, Prometheus, with the whole ecosystem next to it, to do some first attempts into real observability. But the idea up front was, we're going to do this and it's going to be magic and automated, and it's going to be fine because we know how to do this. And still, that was a really hard journey. The real question there is, do you need observability? Because at that point, they didn't need it yet. They didn't even have a production workload. They needed to focus on getting their metrics. They needed to focus on getting their health and basically building a stable platform. So the third case I want to talk about is a customer who basically said, we want observability. They were a software as a service platform. They were running stable for quite a while, but they said we have a performance problem. And they also said we want to have some alerts on our cron jobs if they run too long. And we want dashboards, because everybody wants dashboards. So when we started working with them, it's like, okay, so what do you have in place? We have some metrics in place, we have some monitoring in place. So why do you think you have a performance problem? Well, sometimes a job, when it runs, it just takes ages. And we want to figure out where. And the first thing we figured out is like, they hadn't even looked at their database logs. Like, you opened up the log file, and the only thing you saw was like, slow query logs all over the place. You don't need to have observability tooling. You don't need to have additional tooling if you don't already look at what you have in place. So a couple of indexes later, we basically sped up their performance. And the cron jobs they wanted to be monitoring, they wanted to have them in nice dashboards. But their ops folks actually already had alerts on long-running cron jobs. And they already had alerts on broken cron jobs. And each time when their ops folks talked to their developers like, hey, we have this problem because this cron job failed here, their developers went like, nah. But management wanted more visibility. They didn't even realize they already had the features because they weren't using it. So they sat together and they figured out, well, we're not going to send those alerts of the failing cron jobs to the ops folks anymore, but we're going to send them straight to the developers. Didn't really fix the problem because the developers also didn't take ownership. But at least the operations folks weren't annoyed anymore because of the fact, and it kind of worsened because now it was end users complaining that, hey, this data hasn't been sent, and then the developers thought, oh yeah, I got a mail about that, maybe I should do something about it. And about 3 months later, they finally started realizing, like, what is the operational part of things? And they started to understand that they need to spend time with that. The business also wanted to create dashboards on business metrics. And they were like, yeah, Prometheus can do that for us. Yeah, you can get a nice Grafana dashboard, but if you want to know things like how many purchases and how many components that a user has looked at and all of those things, you're going to need to write some kind of code to calculate that somewhere and then put a counter somewhere and do that. We're not going to magically be able to just put things in place and it's going to work. We can't invent your business metrics. You need to do some work for that. So that customer basically, they wanted improvement. They had already a bunch of things in place they didn't even realize they had in place. And it was really a matter of sitting down together with all the people and saying, hey, you already have this, how about you deal with it differently? They didn't really need observability. So the thing we really see a lot is that everybody claims to be doing it and nobody's actually doing it, because the amount of other customers where we walked into and said, yeah, we do observability, which is basically some business metric dashboards which we were talking about 5 to 10 years ago. That's not observability. So we're going to talk about observability, right? So how do you do this? To me, the first step is like figuring out what the goal is. Like sitting together with people and figuring out, why do we do this? Do we expect performance problems, or do we really have them already? Like, one of the really large use cases for people is like, we don't know what we're monitoring anymore. We don't know what we're running anymore. Please tell us what we're running. How are things talking to each other? How are things working together? Is that something you want to fix by monitoring, or is that something you need to fix up front when you start building things? I mean, the whole joke of you need a service mesh to clean up the mess you've made in your container ecosystem, monitoring is not going to fix that. And yeah, a lot of them really go like, we just want to do this for the hipster credits. We just want to do Prometheus and Loki and Timber because it's what the cool kids do. And in 2 or 3 years, we're going to have the people who say, hey, Gartner told us so, because Gartner's going to be 5 years late on actually doing this and talking about this. So that's Gartner-driven development. I mean, sadly, it's reality. So most people need to sit down, need to talk, need to figure out what they want to do. And then they'll come and realize we need to fix our monitoring, because we cannot start monitoring, we cannot start improving things if we don't even have our monitoring in place. That means they need to have a single source of truth. That means they have to have things automated. I mean, my last talk here was about automating monitoring with Ansible. We've been doing similar things with Puppet. I mean, the automation tools will help you. And then sit together with your people and create clear and actionable alerts. Don't just let Prometheus figure out what might be an error and spam everybody with it. That's not going to help you. You want actionable alerts. You only want to page people when there's something they can do. And then you want to keep that green. You want to keep that stack healthy. And when you're there, a year later, your next challenge is you start looking at your metrics. You start looking at, do you have everything in place you need? And trust me, you won't. The number of times that we had in our internal infrastructure setups where I was like, I want to see those MySQL metrics. And I started looking and I was like, where are they? I can't find them anymore. Where's my dashboard? Somebody move my dashboard. Why have we disabled metrics collection on this thing like 3 weeks ago? I think we internally had that kind of regression already 2 to 3 times. And it's frustrating because you know you want those metrics. You know you need them at some point. And still they disappeared. So you need to basically be checking if you still have them. I'm also pretty sure that you're not shipping all the logs you need, or that your log parsing is actually broken, or that your Logstash or Elk cluster is actually out of memory because you set it up. You're playing with it, but you're not tuning it. And it has been growing, and it has been accumulating more data, and you've not purged the data. And at some point, when you need it, it's going to be broken. So, regression and metric shipping, yeah, I mentioned that. Dashboards being broken. I did an Ignite yesterday about fixing that problem. But the number of times somebody just goes onto Grafana, clicks and edit a dashboard, and makes it look the way he or she wants to have that view, which basically solves the problem for them. But for the other colleagues, they go to the same dashboard and they're like, where's the data I care about? Building dashboards is something that we can spend hours on discussing, because everybody wants to see different things. The first discussion you'll have is what needs to be in the dashboard, how does it need to look, and how does it be readable? And then the second discussion, which is going to take even longer, is like, what do you, as a user for those dashboards, care about? Which is why I really, really want to talk about automating those dashboards and having multiple dashboards with different views available for everybody who wants to use them. And then we can start talking about observability. Like, who wants this? Why do you want it? Is it the developers asking? Is it the operations people asking? Is it management asking it? And sit together. Get those people together in a room and ask them what is really, really hurting them. Why they need this. Performance, not knowing how things work, understanding things. And this is what we've been talking about for 10 plus years. This is what DevOps is about. Collaborate, sit together, listen to each other. And the next challenge is actually starting to build one. Like choosing the right stack. And today that is really, really not easy. Like there's a lot of open source out there. There's a lot of people who claim to be open but aren't. There's a lot of people who are switching to licenses because of different reasons. They're actually going to reduce your flexibility. So that's tough decisions for you to make. What do you want? And then you need to build your stack, or you need to figure somebody to build it. And the thing most people forget is that you need to monitor that stack also. You need some external thing to monitor to see if it's still on. Who monitors the monitor? And then you build one project, like the project with the most pain. Because you're not going to enable all of this at once on one stack. Just pick one project and see how can we use this? How can we learn from this? Build the dashboards together with your people. And then figure out what's missing. And basically, if you add tracing to things, feature flag it. Don't do it for everything. Because what are your typical pitfalls? Well, you will DDoS yourself if you do this full scale. You will basically run out of the disk space. You will put an internal denial of service attack against your own infrastructure. If you start monitoring things the wrong way, you will kill things. Like, for example, if you just take the MySQL exporter and you query everything, you will flood your disks. You will have I/O problems on your cluster, and you'll figure out that the hard way. You will kill Cortex if you want to. And you start wondering why. What data do I really care about? Same with tracing. Snapshot them. Do samples. Don't do all of this. The other challenge there is will this even fit my ecosystem? There's a bunch of proprietary vendors where we'll just go and give you the nice demo with their perfectly built application exactly for the use case they built. And it's going to work, and it's going to be awesome, and they're going to give you that demo. It's like, oh, this is what I want. What they're not going to tell you is the amount of effort they spent in building that demo. Your developer is going to say, well, it's not going to be this simple. We're not going to need to do some things. We might need to do some actual instrumentation and just spend time with it. This is where you need to trust your developers and not your salespeople and not Gartner or whatever organization that tells you they know how things run. And then there's more chaos, like maturity of the stacks. Philip gave a talk about OpenTelemetry yesterday. There are so many things moving around. They're definitely not in the stable state. Like, if you're running a Java shop, it's going to be quite okay, but what if you run PHP? You're going to be working a lot hard to get that things going. And you will get to the point where you need to do modifications in your code. if you really want to learn. So just putting in place a tool saying this is magically going to solve things is not going to happen. I mean, you might not even need observability yet, but you do need to fix your monitoring. And that is going to actually fix your culture if your monitoring is back healthy. Questions? Question, yeah. Just ask it, I'll repeat it.
You say clean up your monitoring. What is for you the point of monitoring is clean up? Is there a place for some alarms, or do I have to do the 100% work to get all clean? Is there a point that I can say, okay, I have reached the most I can get, and some is always broken?
Yeah. So the question is, how do you figure out if your monitoring is fixed? Where do you want to get, and how do you know that you are there? And Bram Vogelaar was here yesterday. He gave a talk. We worked together for quite a long time. And he basically came with the idea that if you can memorize the perma-X and the actual issues in your problems, in your stack, if they're like a one-screen issue, like there's maybe 5, 10, 15, and you actually can identify them and know those 5 things we still need to care, those 10 things we still need to talk, we need to fix, then you're in a healthy shape. If it's such, he calls it, I think it's if you go below 1.5% of your checks being an act or in a bad state, that is where you want to be. Because things will always break and things will always be in flux and things will always be helping. But if you can look at a dashboard and say, yeah, those 9 things we know about, oh, now there's 12, we do have a problem. And that should be things you can control. And that actually gets you to a point where you get healthy. One of the talks we never gave, which we had planned for KingGag Conf 2 years ago, was my on-call engineer didn't realize he was on call last week. That is where you get with that point. Like, was I on call last week? If your on-call folks ask that question, you're healthy. And we have people who had that question, like, multiple times. Like, the week, wait, was I on call last week? I didn't realize, didn't get any page. That's when you have a healthy system. More questions? No more questions.
Seeing as there are none, there's nothing left to do but to bribe you to come back.
So Bernd knows how to bribe me, and that's with Lego.
We'll have that prepared next time, maybe. Thank you very much, Kris.